On a cold morning in March 1923, a logger named James McCarthy stood at the base of a Douglas fir in Washington state. The tree was 210 feet tall, taller than a 20-story building. McCarthy strapped steel spikes to his boots, wrapped a rope around his waist, and began to climb. 40 minutes later, his body hit the ground at 120 miles per hour. James McCarthy was a high climber. His job was to scale the tallest trees in the forest, climb higher than most men would ever go, and cut off the top while standing 200 feet in the air. He did this with no safety harness, no backup rope, no helmet, just 2 steel spikes and a single rope. Between 1900 and 1940, thousands of men like James McCarthy climbed into the clouds of the Pacific Northwest. They were the highest paid workers in the logging camps, earning double what other loggers made. They also had the highest death rate. 1 in 10 high climbers never made it down alive. This is the story of the men who climbed 200-foot trees with nothing but rope and spikes, and why so many of them died doing it. To understand why men climb trees to their deaths, you have to understand the problem logging companies faced in the early 1900s. The Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Northern California had the tallest, most valuable timber in North America. Douglas firs reaching 250 feet. Sitka spruce over 300 feet. Western red cedars with trunks 15 feet wide. These trees were worth a fortune, but they were also impossible to move with traditional methods. In the 1800s, loggers felled trees and used oxen or horses to drag them out of the forest. That worked fine for smaller timber back east, but in the Pacific Northwest, a single log could weigh 50 tons. No animal could move that. Logging companies needed a new system, and in the 1890s, they found one: high-lead cable logging. Here's how it worked. You find the tallest, straightest tree in your logging area. This becomes your spar tree, essentially a living crane. You send a man up to the top of that tree. He cuts off the crown, the top 30 to 50 feet, creating a flat platform. Then you rig heavy steel cables from the topped tree, running them out into the forest. The cables connect to a steam-powered engine on the ground called a donkey engine. Now you have a stationary crane system. You can drag massive logs from deep in the forest, lift them over obstacles, and haul them to the railroad or river. It was brilliant. It was efficient. It made logging companies millions of dollars. But it required one thing. Someone had to climb that 200-foot tree to top it and rig the cables. There were no helicopters, no cranes, no hydraulic lifts, no way to get cables to the top except to send a man up with a rope and hope he didn't fall. Every logging camp needed multiple spar trees. A large operation might set up 10 to 20 spar trees in a single season. Each one required a climber. This created a new job in the logging industry, the professional high climber. And that job had the highest death rate of any occupation in America. So what did a high climber carry up a 200-foot tree? Let me walk you through the equipment. All of it. First, climbing spurs, also called gaffs or spikes. These were steel spikes, about 2 to 3 inches long, curved slightly inward. They were attached to leather pads that strapped onto the outside of your boots. Here's how they worked. You kicked the spike into the bark of the tree, transferred your full body weight onto that one spike, then kicked the other spike higher up. Repeat over and over for 200 feet. Those 2 spikes were the only thing holding you to the tree. Second, the climbing rope. Some men called it a safety belt, which is almost funny considering how unsafe it was. This was a manila rope, about 20 to 30 feet long, roughly an inch and a half thick. You wrapped it around the tree trunk and around your waist, threading it through a metal ring on your belt. The idea was simple. You lean back against the rope to take weight off your legs while you repositioned your spikes. The rope stops you from falling backward off the tree. That was your safety system. One rope. Third, your tools. A hand saw and an axe, usually hanging from loops on your belt. Together, they weighed 6 to 8 pounds. Extra weight you had to carry up. You needed the axe to chop off branches on the way up. You needed the saw to cut through the top of the tree once you got there. And that was it. No backup rope, no harness with multiple attachment points, no shock-absorbing lanyard, no helmet, no radio to call for help. Just 2 steel spikes, 1 rope, and some cutting tools. Your life depended entirely on whether those spikes held in the bark and whether that rope stayed intact. Let me explain the physics of what a high climber was doing. Imagine you're 50 feet up this tree. Your entire body weight, 150, 180, 200 pounds, is supported by 2 steel spikes that have penetrated maybe 2 inches into the wood. Your back is arched. You're leaning away from the tree, held by the rope around your waist. Your legs are bent, knees pushing outward to keep the spikes engaged. Every few seconds, you have to move. You pull yourself closer to the tree, lift 1 spike out, kick it higher, transfer your weight, then repeat with the other leg. At the same time, you're managing the rope. As you climb higher, you have to loosen it, swing it up a foot or 2, then retighten it around the tree. This takes immense upper body strength, core stability, and leg power. You're essentially doing a full body workout while dangling in the air. And you're doing this for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on the height of the tree. By the time you reach the top, your muscles are screaming, your hands are cramping, your legs are shaking from exhaustion. And that's when you have to do the most dangerous part of the job. But before we get to that, let's talk about what could go wrong on the climb itself, because plenty of men died before they ever reached the top. Problem number 1, rotten bark. From the ground, a tree might look solid, but 80 feet up, you kick your spike into what looks like good wood, and it punches straight through into rot. No warning, the spike just goes into nothing. Your weight shifts, the other spike tears out, and you're falling. The rope might catch you. Might, if it's positioned right and if it holds. But if you're in the process of moving the rope when the spike fails, there's nothing stopping your fall. Problem number 2, wet or frozen wood. Rain was common in the Pacific Northwest, so was morning frost. When wood was wet or iced over, the bark became slippery. Spikes that would normally hold firm could slide right out under your body weight, especially if you shifted your weight too quickly or at the wrong angle. Men would be halfway up a climb, reposition their weight, and feel both spikes slip simultaneously. By the time they realized what was happening, they were already falling. Problem number 3, the rope fraying. Manila rope was strong, but it wasn't indestructible. Every time you slid it up the tree, it rubbed against rough bark. Every time you leaned back on it, fibers stretched and weakened. Ropes were reused day after day, climb after climb. Logging companies didn't replace them until they broke. And sometimes they broke with a man 150 feet in the air. The sound of a rope snapping was described by survivors as a gunshot crack. And then you were in free fall. Problem number 4, branches. Dead branches stuck out from the trunk at random intervals. Sometimes you could chop them off as you climbed, but sometimes they were too thick or positioned in a way that made them hard to reach. These branches could catch your rope as you moved it upward. If the rope snagged and you didn't notice, you'd create slack in the system. Then, when you leaned back to rest, the rope wouldn't catch you immediately. You'd drop a foot, maybe 2 feet, before the rope went taut. That sudden jerk could pull the spikes out, or it could snap the rope entirely. Problem number 5, exhaustion. Climbing 200 feet with nothing but arm strength and leg power is brutal. Your forearms burn, your grip weakens, your legs start to tremble. At a certain point, your body simply gives out. Some men made it to 180 feet and couldn't go any further. But they couldn't stay there either. They had to get back down. Descending was just as dangerous as going up. You had to lower yourself spike by spike, managing the rope, all while your muscles were already destroyed. Men lost their grip. Men's legs gave out. Men made one small mistake because they were too tired to think clearly, and they fell. Let's say you made it to the top. You're now 200 feet above the ground. You're exhausted. The wind is stronger up here. The tree is swaying. Now comes the hard part. You have to cut off the top of the tree. This is called topping, and it's why you climbed in the first place. The company needs a flat platform at the top to anchor the cables for the high lead system. So you have to saw through the trunk and drop 30 to 50 feet of tree. Here's the problem. When you cut through the trunk, you're removing a massive amount of weight from the top of the tree. That weight has been pulling the tree in one direction, usually slightly downward and outward. The moment you finish the cut and that top section falls away, all that tension releases. The tree whips. Imagine holding a long, flexible stick and bending the tip downward. Then imagine suddenly cutting off the tip. The stick snaps back violently. That's what happens to a 200-foot tree when you remove the crown. The entire tree sways hard, sometimes 20 feet in one direction, sometimes 30 feet. The tree bends, snaps back, bends the other way, and sways violently for several seconds before it stabilizes. And you're standing on top of it. There's no way to predict which direction the tree will whip. It depends on the grain of the wood, the wind direction, the angle of the cut, and factors you can't see from the top. Sometimes the tree would whip so violently that men were thrown clear off, just launched into the air. A man named Robert Hansen was topping a Sitka spruce in Oregon in 1921. When the top fell, the tree whipped to the left, then snapped hard to the right. Hansen was thrown 30 feet laterally through the air. He hit another tree on the way down. Then he hit the ground. He was 24 years old. Other men weren't thrown off. They managed to hold on during the whip. But the violence of the movement would dislodge their spikes or snap their rope. Once the spikes came out, there was nothing holding them. They'd slide down the trunk for a few feet, desperately trying to re-jam the spikes back into the wood. Some succeeded, most didn't. In 1918, a high climber named Thomas Mercer was topping a Douglas fir in Washington. He made the final cut. The top fell away, and the tree whipped backward. Mercer held on, but the whip tore both his spikes out of the bark. He slid 15 feet down the trunk, clawing at the wood with his hands, before his rope caught on a broken branch stub. The rope held for about 3 seconds, then it snapped. Mercer fell 180 feet. A witness on the ground said he saw Mercer's body tumbling through the air, arms and legs flailing, before he hit the ground. He was killed instantly. Even if you survived the topping, your job wasn't done. Now you had to rig the cables. This meant attaching heavy steel cables to the topped tree, cables that weighed hundreds of pounds. Ground crews would haul the cables up using ropes and pulleys, and you had to guide them, secure them, and make sure they were positioned correctly. This could take hours. The entire time, you're still 200 feet in the AIR, standing on a platform barely wider than your body, exhausted from the climb and the topping. One mistake, a missed step, a moment of dizziness, a gust of wind, and you fall. And here's the thing. Even if you did everything perfectly, you still weren't safe. Because once those cables were rigged and the donkey engine started pulling logs, the spar tree was under constant stress. Cables could snap. The tree itself could crack and split. High climbers often had to go back up the same tree multiple times to adjust rigging or make repairs. Every time they climbed, they rolled the dice again. So how many men died? The numbers are hard to pin down exactly, because logging companies didn't always keep records. Or they didn't report deaths. Or they buried men in unmarked graves at camp and never told the families. But we have some data. According to records from the Washington State Department of Labor, high climbers had a mortality rate of 10 to 15% during the peak of high lead logging in the 1910s and the 1920s. That means 1 out of every 10 men who took the job died doing it. For comparison, the mortality rate for underground coal miners during the same period was about 3%. High climbers were 3 to 5 times more likely to die than coal miners, who were already doing one of the most dangerous jobs in America. In the Pacific Northwest alone, it's estimated that 50 to 75 high climbers died every year between 1900 and 1930. That's more than 1,500 men over 3 decades. And that's just the deaths. It doesn't count the men who were permanently injured, broken backs, shattered legs, crushed spines, and could never work again. Let me give you 3 specific cases. Real men, real deaths. Case 1, William Tanner, age 29, Washington State, 1919. Tanner was 160 feet up a Douglas fir when his climbing rope frayed and snapped. He fell backward off the tree, hit 2 branches on the way down, and landed on a pile of logs. The impact killed him instantly. His skull was fractured in 3 places. The logging company buried him in an unmarked grave near the camp. His wife in Oregon didn't find out he was dead until 2 weeks later when another logger happened to pass through her town and mentioned it. She received no compensation, no death benefit, nothing. Case 2, Frank Dutton, age 22, Oregon, 1923. Dutton was topping a Sitka spruce when the bark under his left spike gave way. He scrambled to stay on the tree, but his right spike pulled out a second later. He fell 210 feet. A witness said Dutton was conscious for part of the fall. He was grabbing at branches, trying to catch himself. Every branch he grabbed broke. He hit the ground and died within minutes. Case 3, Carl Jensen, age 31, California, 1925. Jensen made it through the climb and the topping without incident. He was rigging the cables when a sudden gust of wind hit the tree. The tree swayed. Jensen lost his balance, reached out to grab the cable for support, but missed. He fell sideways off the tree, tumbling 190 feet through the air before hitting the ground. He left behind a wife and 2 children. They received nothing from the logging company. So why did men keep doing this job? Why would anyone voluntarily climb 200-foot trees with no safety equipment, knowing the death rate was 1 in 10? The answer is simple: money. High climbers were the highest paid workers in any logging camp. They made $5 to $7 per day, sometimes more. That might not sound like much, but for context, a ground-level logger, a faller or bucker, made $2 to $3 per day. A high climber made double, sometimes triple, what other men made. For men who were desperate, that was life-changing money. That was the difference between your family eating or going hungry. That was the difference between keeping a roof over your head or losing everything. And many high climbers were young men, 18, 20, 22 years old. They were strong, they were fearless, and they believed it wouldn't happen to them. They'd seen other men fall. They'd been there when bodies hit the ground. But they convinced themselves they were different, faster, smarter, more careful. That's what every dead high climber thought too. There was also a culture around the job. In logging camps, high climbers were respected. They were seen as the toughest, the bravest, the most skilled. If you turned down a high climbing job, you were labeled a coward, weak, not a real logger. Men took the job to prove themselves, and logging companies encouraged this. They didn't care about safety. They cared about speed and profit. If a high climber died, they'd bury him and hire another one the next day. There were always more men willing to take the risk. One foreman was quoted in a 1922 newspaper article saying, "We lose a few boys every year, but there's plenty more where they came from." That was the attitude. Your life meant nothing to the company. You were disposable, replaceable. And if you died, your family got nothing. No death benefits, no compensation, no pension. The company would sometimes pay for a cheap pine coffin. Sometimes they wouldn't even do that. This continued for decades. Men climbed, men died, companies made millions. It wasn't until the 1930s and the 1940s that safety regulations started to appear. Labor unions began organizing in the Pacific Northwest. Workers demanded safer conditions. They demanded equipment. They demanded accountability. And slowly, painfully slowly, things began to change. The first safety harnesses for high climbers appeared in the early 1940s. These were simple systems, a backup rope attached to a second belt, but they cut the death rate dramatically. By the 50s, modern climbing harnesses with multiple attachment points became standard. Fatality rates among high climbers dropped by 90% almost overnight. 90%. That's how many men didn't have to die. That's how many lives could have been saved if companies had cared enough to spend $10 on a backup rope. Today, professional tree climbers use advanced safety systems. They have shock-absorbing lanyards, full-body harnesses, helmets, and communication equipment. They have regulations that require multiple redundant safety systems. If one fails, there are two more backups. Modern tree climbers still do dangerous work, but they go home alive. The men who climbed in the early 1900s didn't have that luxury. They climbed 200-foot trees with nothing but spikes and a rope because that's what the job required. They did it for money, for pride, because they had no other choice. And thousands of them died. The trees they climbed are mostly gone now. The old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest were logged out by the 1950s. But if you hike through what's left of those forests, you can still find old spar trees. Topped trees with flat platforms at the top, slowly rotting away. They're monuments to an industry that built America, and to the men who died building it. The trees are still standing. The men who climbed them aren't.